Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the founding chair of the MA Curatorial Practice program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And each week for the Curatorial Roundtable, I invite a distinguished curator or institutional director to speak about their practice. And today I'm very happy to have Anna Mustonen with us. One thing before we begin, just to say that Anna will speak for about 50 minutes. And then at the bottom of your screen, you can hit Q&A and please type into Q&A your question or comment for Anna. If you don't see Q&A at the bottom of your screen, there's now a more button and you can click on that and find Q&A there. So with that, I'm just going to read a short bio of Anna and hand things over to her. So, Anna Mustonen is the chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Kiasma in Helsinki. At Kiasma, she plays a leading role in shaping the museum's artistic program, particularly in relation to Nordic and international contemporary practices. Trained at University College London, where she earned her MA in the history of art. She's worked at leading international institutions in private galleries in Europe, including Tate, Kumu Art Museum, Haunch of Venison, and Victoria Miro. She's curated exhibitions for Fotografiska, Helsinki Kunsthalle, and Kai Art Center Tallinn, among many others. Mustonen is the curator of the Nordic Countries Pavilion at the 61st International Art Exhibition, the Venice Biennale, coming in May. So I guess you're deep into it, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for everyone who's joined. I trust you are there, although I can't see you. And I very much look forward to hearing any questions after I've spoken. And I guess as a starting point, I wanted to stress that this is not meant as a lecture. It's more, I guess, reflections of the things that are shaped my own curatorial practice in the recent years. And it's I guess it's things that concern everybody, whether you're a studying curator, or you've been working for a long time. We've been thrown quite a few curveballs in the past few years, and it doesn't look like it's changing. And also, I guess I wanted to also say that the things I'm speaking about, they're not finished positions, so they constantly in flux as we kind of trying to adjust to the new normal. That might be something completely different again in a few days or a few years or a few months. So it's something that's kind of more a consideration rather than a ways of doing things. Stephen kindly shared a bit more about my history. So just to mention, I was born in Finland, and I lived here until I went to university, which I did in the UK. And I stayed abroad for a very long time, working in the institutions that Stephen mentioned, and have been back in Finland just before the pandemic, actually. Some of the things that I will speak about will be related to that. And also wanting to start with a personal anecdote of mine of how I came into curating. You can use the titles and the studies and different things and concerns, but for me, my family used to travel quite a lot when I was small, especially in Europe. And my parents are not in the art field, but we used to visit a lot of museums and institutions, especially in France. They loved France and still love France now. And this is a picture of me and my father in Musée Picasso in southern France, in Antibes. And that's me and my father in the right-hand corner. And I remember these were the first things that I kind of noticed was the engagement of audiences, particularly children of my age, or in this picture, they probably younger than I was, and how you communicate art, how it becomes as a kind of reflection and translation of things that affect many people, and how you can kind of encourage this kind of interest in the audiences, give them new ideas and different ways of looking at it. And it wasn't in this museum, but there's a particularly poignant moment where we were, I think, in a museum in Paris, and where the teacher was telling the children about the grains of sand in the Monet painting. So it wasn't actually the content of the painting, it was the context of the painting. So this is the kind of things that have always interested me, and very much public-facing idea of curating rather than authorship. And this kind of takes to the topic of today. So I titled the slide "Why Crisis Became a Framework." And as many of us remember, the pandemic, it wasn't an interruption as such, it was a structural break. So it forced us curators or people working in the industry to rethink the ways in which we work. And not just the way we work within the institutions, but also the way we work within communities and with our audiences. And especially when it comes to curating, and we're curating projects that are international, so it affects the way we work with artists. And these ways of kind of new ways of working, we didn't know at the time whether that was going to be a short period and then we'd adjust and go back. But actually, these have become things that we continue to work with and continues to shape the practice now. So they're kind of lasting effect of it. And I guess the key points are during, when think about curating during the pandemic was you can travel. So that goes both for the transport of the work, the artist traveling, curators traveling, doing anything else. So what becomes central in this scenario is trust, because you have to somehow distribute the way in which you work, and you become reliant on technology and other people and many other factors that are completely out of your control. And I chose as my first case study as a show I did with Patricia Piccinini, an Australian artist. We started planning her show in Helsinki with the title Between the Shadow and the Soul in Helsinki Kunsthalle before the pandemic. So I traveled to see her in Australia in January, I'm thinking back now, I think it's 2020. And on the way back, I traveled through Singapore, and all of a sudden everybody was in hazmat suits, spraying all the surfaces, cleaning everything. And then you knew there was something that was about to change. And then some weeks later, then everything happened. But I'm speaking about these two exhibitions together because the first installment was planned and designed and thought about before the pandemic. And the second installment, which was in the Kai Art Center, The Instruments of Life, coming from Mary Shelley, was designed during the pandemic. So we had completely different considerations because we already knew that this is what was limiting us. So these were the concepts, context that I just given you. And we can start looking at some of the works from installation images from the exhibition in Helsinki. So this was obviously designed ahead, but the communication at this time, also because she was in Australia, was through drawings, through video calls, through everything else. So everything was worked at as a distance, and then there's also the time difference. So that was always going to be there. But the exhibition design this is more like a natural museum feel, so that we have some of these kind of really iconic works by her. You might know there's a Sanctuary, which is the two bonobo monkeys hugging. There's Big Mother, the breastfeeding ape kind of a figure, and there's many of these that kind of put in a completely different setting, and this was designed beforehand. And even the installation project itself was that I was in the museum and the artist was on a video call on the other side of the world, and her team and her partner, and we were just discussing this everything from a distance and making decisions, shared decisions. And also the artist had to trust me as a curator and the institution to kind of make the right ethical choices. And this installation is called Alone with the Gods. And this became what I saw myself as the kind of reflection of the pandemic time. So the idea of the installation is there is it was a existing installation, but all the elements like the structures, the furniture, and everything else is sourced locally. And there's a video of this fictional character who speaks about this lost cult. He's the only member left, and he's talking to an empty room. Some of these, they're older sculptures. So these are, the sculptures were selected to be part of this show, but all the structures and everything else has been built in situ or bought in charity shops or everything, in local places. And normally the artist does this herself or her team does it. But again, we had to redistribute the kind of act of looking for the furniture, planning the design, how would it look? So this was all kind of done as almost a reflection of the time that we were living in. And it wasn't really meant to be the big key thing of the exhibition because of the very famous works that many of us know. But for me, this was the symbolic of the time. And some of the sculptures are kind of placed on shiny surfaces. So there's reflections of the artwork, but also you see the reflection of yourself in an empty room. Excuse me. So this became kind of very telling of this time and also telling of the process of curating as a collaborative action rather than it being some kind of authorship or artist and the curator making these decisions individually or as a small group. So here you can still see some of those reflections, and actually a few of these sculptures are by Patricia's partner Peter Hennessy as well. So there's also the collaboration of her and her partner as part of the installation. And finally, this video work, the original video work in the exhibition was supposed to be about the bushfires, which was when I traveled to Australia in the early 2020, was the real concern. So the real concern was whether we were going to be able to get the works out of the country or whether everything is closed because of the very broad bushfires. And then all of a sudden, the entire situation became something different. So the bushfires weren't the primary concern. So this work is called, the video work is called Awakening, and is very much kind of a reflection of birth or something. And the characters, the shiny ceramic characters, are called shoe forms, which are kind of half shoe, half plant or half mushroom. So these kind of sprouting forms that are also kind of representations of something new and I guess a renewal. So in this kind of gloominess of this exhibition, the key message that the artist, both artists and I wanted to get across was the idea of hope. So it was very much like a full circle from the dystopia of Alone with the Gods and then becoming this kind of hopeful future sprouting from something. And this is a work called Shadowbat, which is near extinct, based on a near extinct type of bats in Australia. So moving on to the next installment of the exhibition, which was in Kai Art Centre in Tallinn. So the concerns we knew, and the exhibition took a completely different shape, although many of the works were the same. So the only installation we left out was Alone with the Gods. And this exhibition became more about the use of the space. So we noticed during the exhibition in Helsinki how, because there were less people in the museums that would normally be crowded, you would have less people and they would pay more attention to the work. So it became this kind of almost one-to-one experiencing of the individual sculptures, and this kind of very personal encounters of what types of memories or what types of emotions this work will bring in you, which is very different to all the people. So kind of some things I noticed, during and post-pandemic is the kind of this change in attention and in the way that people are more patient, because you're finally allowed to go out and see something and not just, stare at your screen or, see only the people inside your bubble. So this kind of exhibition space became a space of, new types of encounters, both with the work, but also with other people. So you can see from here that it looks very different. So the other exhibition was quite dark, and this has very much light on it. You have kind of the individual objects that are placed at a distance, almost in the same way that we were socially distancing at the time. So you have this kind of a safety space between yourself and the work. And you allowed to kind of take in the detail more and move around the work. So this is a piece called Sapling, which is inspired by this very old tree that the authorities wanted to get rid of in Melbourne at the time. So, and this is kind of reversing the roles of mother as a carer. You have a father as a carer, and you have a half child, half tree. So you kind of have these emotive responses to these kind of acts of kindness or closeness that we couldn't experience in real life at the time. So it becomes a very, very different encounter altogether, although you have the same works. And I rewrote the text to have kind of these considerations and the way that you would be looking at the works. And in here you see even the shadow bat that was really high up in in its own dark higher space here becomes in the light, and you can see it. So the themes are very much heightened, because these are the themes that Piccinini works with anyway. But at this time of humans at the brink of some kind of disappearance, we could relate to these animals in a very different way. And here are a few apologies. I think the one on the right looks a little bit like your current president. I'm not allowed to say that. Probably this is called loafers, but it's very much this kind of closeness and hugging and togetherness and warmth that is present in her work. That is just became central to this. So for me, I put for me in brackets because it probably changed lots of things for lots of people, and it also changed lots of things for me personally, and not in my working role. But for me, what it changed is that the curatorial authority became more distributed, and what I mean by that is that there wasn't one person making the exhibition. It had to become a collaboration. It had to be a process of negotiation. The care and the ethics were very much on the foreground, both as a curatorial responsibility, but also for me as a very significant topic or context in which to think about artwork and to think about how we experience it. And I guess it also made me understand that there's the distance that you have between people, whether that's physical or emotional. It stayed with us as a kind of a permanent condition that I still continue to have to kind of navigate with. And we're still using the same tools we hear on Zoom now, which we wouldn't have done 10 years ago. So I think these kind of elements that you had to accept as part of your own practice. And here is the final image of that show in the Kai Art Center in Tallinn, where you see the symbolic birth video at the back room, and then the mother and the baby coming to their life. So I felt that this was kind of a very symbolic way of closing the talking about Patricia's work and these two exhibitions. And moving on, as if pandemic wasn't enough, we're facing a very different situation now. I guess, it's political distance, I guess you would call it, the geopolitical strains that we all faced with in the current climate, and it's different scalability of these similar restrictions, if you like, that you have to encounter. And I think the what connects the pandemic and the current political climate is the sense of pressure. So it's the pressure on bodies, it's the pressure on institutions, and the interpretation of things. I will be speaking about the Nordic Pavilion shortly, which I'm curating in Venice this spring. So the scale is different, but the condition feels very similar in some ways to the pandemic, where you kind of navigate these grounds that you are not familiar with. So speaking about the Nordic Countries Pavilion, just a little bit of more details. So it's a pavilion that many of you might be familiar with. It's a shared pavilion for Finland, Sweden, and Norway. My understanding, it might be the only one that is always shared. And we take turns to take charge of the exhibition in both architecture and in the arts biennial. And it was designed by Sverre Fehn, who's a Norwegian architect, and completed in 1962. And for the pavilion, the architecture goes hand in hand with the values, the Nordic values, which is even more so now. It feels very heightened in this kind of push and pull of the politics of the world. So we share this openness, reflective surfaces of kind of being and being together in the space that we look for and care. So it's a very important place, and I should say that, but I think it is the most beautiful pavilion in Venice. Excuse me. And then I've added some of the images in here where you can see the architecture. Let's see, I have a few others. So here you can see the trees inside. And in the Nordic Countries Pavilion, we will have three artists, one very democratically, one from each country. We'll have Dori Vrones, Clara Kristalova, and Benjamin Orlow. And the three artists are working with the pavilion as a collaboration. It is not a group show. And I also like to think about it as that building itself is the fourth artist. And as the current climate, so we started planning this almost a year ago, more than a year ago. And the topic itself hasn't changed so much, but I think the way in which we expect the interpretation of it, or we expect a reading of the artworks within the pavilion has very much changed with the times and with the current climate. So that's something that we've had to kind of negotiate and take into consideration. And for example, the text that I wrote initially, I've kind of altered quite drastically for the pavilion catalogue, because it's the reading of it seems very different at this moment. So here's a very old one of the early designs of the catalogue. You can see the trees. Some of the trees have died or been taken down or disappeared, but there are a few of the original ones are still left within the pavilion, and they'll be used in the exhibition in the spring in some ways. And here you see the three artists. And also just to note with the artists, so they all have quite different backgrounds. So Benjamin Orlo is his father is Russian and his mother is Finnish Swedish, but he lives in London. And Clara is originally from Prague. And the interesting is that the Czech Pavilion is actually right behind us, so there might be something that we connect her original birthplace with. And the artist very much approached this as I cannot tell too much about the concept because it hasn't been released yet, but the space as a kind of a speculative environment where these mythical figures, I'll show you some examples of their work, not the works in the pavilion, and different emotional states and very uncertain futures overlap. So it's kind of all the work is somehow testing the boundaries of space, but also testing the boundaries of how much we can add into this shared space and in order to still coexist in it. So it becomes this kind of negotiation with the space and bodies and emotions in between those works. And the exhibition is very much open-ended. So I almost thinking about it as a question. That everybody will come to their own answer within the experience of it. And here are some examples of the artist's works. So visually, they draw quite a lot from Nordic mythologies. You can see this is Klara Kristelova's sketch. And these are some of her installations. Again, not the one that we will be showing, but these kind of half human, half animal figures in landscape. So there's a very close relationship with the nature always present. And they all work with kind of monumental materials, but the responses to the material is very performative and quite emotive. So it's very kind of different ways of how we think about sculpture, or in this case as well, is public sculpture that we're talking about, that we're sharing with in Giardini. This is Tori Vorons's video that was shown in a different institution in Finland this year. And her exhibition at the Bergen Kunsthalle in Norway this year. So these are kind of half human, half animal characters that are kind of also negotiating, who's taking over the space, and how much space can they share. And this is Benjamin Orlo's. He works with bronze often, and then he makes monumental clay sculptures that are kind of, each of them are different, and each of them are kind of responding this kind of performative act of making it. So they take quite a long time, from a couple of weeks to several months. And this is a work he did in another space in Finland this year. No, sorry, last year. So, with this in mind, so there's a bit more about the content of the pavilion. And then I want to discuss a bit about the pavilion as a political frame. So, the working with a national pavilion, it has limits and it has different possibilities. So it kind of frames this context of people call Venice as the Olympics of the art world. So is this contest of like you competing or who's going to receive the lion or who. So it becomes this kind of a almost not as a battleground, but this kind of who has this the strongest presentation, who brings this kind of national idea of what our culture is about. But even more so this year. So the Nordic Pavilion is located in close proximity of the Israeli Pavilion, which has been very much as a source of debate in the last few biennials, and not to say this one. On other side of the road, there's a Russian pavilion that has been closed now for some years. And on one side, there's also I'd like to raise it in here because it's the US pavilion, and then on across the road from there is the Danish pavilion. So we are talking about these kind of really different proximities of countries in a context where there is a crisis situation and you trying to do something for your nation or your country, but then you cannot escape and unread these kind of debates. So the shared Nordic Pavilion itself becomes this kind of field of different competing narratives that are pushed from the inside and the outside. And this is certainly the case for all the other pavilions. So the location and the architecture become very significant in kind of reading the meaning of the exhibition and what you're doing. So you cannot, as a curator, not think about it. So this is what I meant when I said I had to rethink my own text and my own concept, because I have to understand that people would read it differently because of where we are in the world, but also where we are located within Giardini, within the Venice Biennale. And here's an illustrated picture. Interesting, I just mentioned the US Pavilion, and there's protesters from pro-Palestine protesters in the I think this is in the last Arts Biennial 24-22. So, and I guess one more thing that I wanted to mention in relation to this is I guess the external pressures, but then also the role of the curator in protecting the artists. So there is also the artists are facing the same tensions. So this is again like a shared collaboration that we work together and we negotiate these outside pressures as a group and as a team. So this very much shaped. These are not simple matters. There isn't a right or wrong answer. Excluding a certain pavilion, will it change? Will somebody boycotting something, will it change? I mean, it's a negotiation. So it's not just a negotiation of the content, it's a negotiation of the entire context that you're working with. So following that, I wanted to take another example, which was the Sami Pavilion in Venice Biennale in 2022. We are also doing an exhibition with a Sami artist here at Kiasma in the spring, in the opening in a couple of months. And again, this is something that many other countries and many other nations share, this kind of ownership of land and what belongs to whom, and this is not something that is specifically for the Nordics. So this is, again, a shared experience that many people can relate with. So with the Sami Pavilion, there was a kind of critical shift in the presentation of a national pavilion. So this was commissioned by Orca in Norway. And the space that was shared with the Nordics, so the Sami goes across all the 3 Nordic countries. So effectively, they are in the Nordics, but they have their own land and their own space. So the exhibition was curated. I'm reading the names here because I cannot remember them. It was curated by Katja Garcia Anton, Lisa Ramna Finnborg, and Berska Nilas, and brought together a practice of 3 artists, Marat Anasara, Paulina Fedorov, and Anders Sunna, who are all Sami artists. And again, this had this kind of very much as a working group. There were other people, not just the head curators, but there was a group of curators working on it, and there was a group of artists working on it. And it really expanded this idea of how the Nordic pavilion can be understood and rethought, and what the nationality means. But for me, this was an amazing example of this idea of curating as a collaboration, which is something that I wanted to bring in to the pavilion this year. And this is a performance by Paulina Fedorov from the opening week. And these are works by Marat Anasara, who has a large commission at the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern that open in the autumn. So there's again been a shift of how artists from let's say from Australia or from that originate, so how they are seen as not as something in the margins of the art world, but they're seen within as a kind of active factors. And I wanted to take this example on the right, which is Marat Anasar's work. And I wrote this down for myself. But when you read about the media of the artwork, what is it made of? So there are different reindeer materials, but then natural materials, but then 2 of the ingredients are fear, in brackets, reindeer under stress, stools, and motor oil. And another ingredient is hope, in brackets, breast milk, reindeer milk, tundra. So this is, again, very interesting way of thinking about the artwork, whether the materials are, the materiality of it, whether that's something that's also conceptual. And if anyone went to see this Venice Biennale, so you will actually smell the fear from that artwork. So it does actually, so there's again this very emotive response that kind of awakens a lot of emotions. And here's another work by her. I think this is the reindeer skin, and another performance. So I'm not sure how we're doing at time. I'm kind of coming towards the end, and I can always go back if there's anything that we would like to discuss more or address. I guess for me, so in my practice, I've become less interested in answers and more interested in the conditions that we're working with. And by that, I mean, I kind of tried to embrace this ambiguity of maybe there aren't answers. Maybe there are as many answers as there are visitors or audiences, and I guess making allowance for contradiction and debate and uncertainty, and kind of giving space I guess, as a curator, giving space to not just the artist, but giving space to audiences and giving space to different types of interpretations of the work. Um, and it's and I guess learning to live with these pressures that we have. Um, and I guess the other thing that I've kind of come, and I mentioned it several times during this talk, is how responsibility and care are central in both of these case studies. But in particular, I would say in protecting artists in these politicized contexts that we're living in, and also as an institution, having this accountability of what you are saying and having the kind of a backbone, I guess, to stand behind your own beliefs and your own ideologies, but also seeing it as a way of negotiation. So there's always risk, and there's the accountability that lands with the curator, but it kind of lacks this kind of idea of authorship where you spell out what you want people to see or read, because that has been taken away from you within these kind of pressured conditions and changing conditions that we have. So I think this is what links these moments, that these kind of two moments of the pandemic and of the political pressures that we're living with now is distance, vulnerability, and care, working without control, an idea of curating as a negotiation under pressure. So it's not a single person doing it, and we cannot do anything by ourselves. And it really takes a village and a lot more than that to be able to kind of navigate the times that we are living in. So that was all I had prepared. I would love to hear some more questions, or even, reflections or feelings or own experiences, if anyone would like to share.
Great, Anna, thanks. Very generative. A lot to consider at this moment. There are quite a few comments, and I will just read things. Um, Mike says, I guess my question is, how do you edit down? If you see an artist's work, how would you choose the pieces that you think reflect the concept and eliminate redundancies?
That's an interesting question, especially when you work with artists that are prolific, which is many of them, or artists, let's say like Patricia Piccinini, who has worked for many years. Again, I it's that is also a process of negotiation. I think that becomes, at least the way in which I work, is that I work in a dialogue with the artist, and a lot of the time when an artist is preparing, let's say, new body of work, and then you look back at some of the previous work, there are kind of these key elements that they want to say at that given time. So it's also giving, I guess, the artist a space of saying, this is what I meant about not having the curatorial authorship, is that I'm giving the space also to the artist to have a voice of what they want to say, and then as a process of selecting the works that I've kind of most meaningful in that context. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so then Patricia Helene Liddy writes, you felt a little closed up and worried about certain pavilions around you. How could the Biennale facilitate conversation between the countries that are in friction, using Venice more as a neutral space to start talking instead of only showing art?
Yes. I mean, this is I would say for me, it's not a personal, it's not a concern. But it's a concern because the pressures come. There's one thing is the pavilion or the biennial organization, which doesn't deliver the pressure, but there are groups. I showed the image of the last biennial or the one before, where there are protesters and artists and curators and institutions are being approached by different sides to kind of try to offer, you need to go to this direction, I need to say these things, and it becomes that you're, rather than the actual buildings in the proximity, which affects the reading of what we show in the pavilion a lot. It's kind of the pressures that are coming from outside of the space itself or outside of those other pavilions. So I think I think personally, I think it would be important to the biennial to address these somehow, and not leave it maybe to the national pavilions to negotiate these pressures, between, because then we do have conversations with other pavilions and also, some of the ones that I've just mentioned, especially with the other Nordics. So we all kind of share this pressure. So I think it would be important for the biennial somehow to open this conversation. Interestingly, this is completely off this chart, but I went to Brazil for Sao Paulo Biennial in the autumn, and I cannot now, because I wasn't going to speak about it. I cannot remember the name of the space, but they had this space run by French Jewish gentleman who offered the space to all different kind of politicized groups, artist groups with very different backgrounds. So they had, a Jewish maybe dance group, and they had Palestinians making paintings, and they all worked in this shared space. And I guess the solution for them was to have, not avoid the conflict, but put those people in the same space where they can debate and they can have contradiction, and they can, it's almost like you cannot run away from it. That's what I'm saying. So I think you'd have to address it, and you'd have to we have to live with this. So by excluding or, closing, I'm not sure if that will help. I think just somehow, because in the art world, the pressures are kind of outside of the art world, I would say. So I think within the community, nobody wants this. That's my experience.
I mean, I should just to add for people who don't know, all of the national pavilions at the Venice Biennale within the Giardini are owned by that country. It's the equivalent of embassies around the world, such that that property is not Italian property. It's the property of the Nordic countries or the United States or Russia, etc. So that puts things into a particular light when you talk, Anna, about curatorial
Mm.
accountability and institutional accountability. There can be inbuilt a kind of tension there that is maybe not resolved. For example, with
Mm.
Israel, where the Israeli artist actually refused to show, who was chosen, and the pavilion was closed. So let me
And
go.
actually, the only
Yeah.
one that is a shared ownership is the Nordic Pavilion. So again, like there is this kind of history of us collaborating, which I found actually really beautiful. So we are still, very small nations, but there is at least this real desire that we have the shared space, which
Mm.
feels good.
And actually, so the next question kind of relates to this. I was wondering, and this might be a sensitive or a big question, why aren't Iceland and Denmark part of the Nordic Pavilion in the Venice Biennale? And is there ever any special dialogue in the spectrum and proximity of nationalities exhibiting?
Hmm. It's not. I think it's a very good question, but it's also so there's two different things as well. There's Scandinavia and then there's the Nordics. So Nordics is actually Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and then Finland is not even part of Scandinavia. So if it was a Scandinavian pavilion, we would be left out. And obviously Iceland is so. I'm happy to look into the answer of that, but I would assume this has come as a result of some kind of we have a very close relationship with especially Sweden and Norway, and also with the other kind of countries in proximity, and now even more so. I lived myself in the Baltics, so I found like we mentally the Finns are even closer to the Baltics. So I think again this it would be interesting to rethink about how these national boundaries can be broken. And I think the Sami pavilion was an example of this, like how does it actually have to, does it have to have because it still has the names of Finland, Sweden, and Norway on the door. So does it actually have to have the names on it?
So that seems to have been the last question. I guess we will, on that note, close and thank you, everyone. Join us next week for Billy Tang speaking to us from London. And Anna, please join me on the link with the students.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining.